Hello, welcome to the Research Cat. Today I want to do a book review of sorts here on the topics that we have been talking about of communications and the lenses that we look at, largely with bias. This is one of my favorite books at looking at how communication directly affects policy in education. Beyond Silenced Voices by Weis and Fine, which are the editors. And this is the 1993 version. There is I believe it's a 2009 version that is currently out and has been updated in some areas. Is probably the one that I would suggest doing. This is the one I'm more intimately familiar with because I used this in my studies. Now, I'm not going to do a traditional book review where I'll say that this is why it is good and this is where I have some problems with it, although I will address that a little bit. Instead, because it's an anthology of studies, and it's looking at class, race, gender issues. And also, it probably should have there on the title economics. It's really looking at a socioeconomic perspective in the United States. And when it says schools, it really means high school. I should point out that this is not not everybody will agree. Let me put it that way. Not everybody will agree with what is in the books. People will have strong opinions that they've preformed, maybe based on personal experience. And who am I to say that your personal experiences are not indicative of what you should think? That's not the goal of education. As an educator, my job is not to tell you what you should think. And personally, I don't think any teacher should be doing that. Instead, it's how we should be thinking about certain topics. When I would teach in a health class, for instance, and there would be various current events that would come up, I would tell students, I'm not always going to tell you what I actually think. I'm going to be the devil's advocate. I'm going to come up with a position opposite of what you believe so that you can defend your position. Why do you believe this particular attitude that you have? In this book, it's looking at how voices of students are being silenced. While it does cover slightly things such as hiring practices that has to do with races, it's mostly looking at students, on how students become marginalized in different ways. And I'm really going to just look at 3 chapters within this book. So I'm going to just turn off this for the moment. As always, I have my Photoshop up here simply because I guess it reminds me of a whiteboard from school, and it allows me to type in it and give you some visualization of it. But we're going to look at chapter 2, which has to do with gifted education. And the full title is Gifted Education and the Protection of Privilege, which is Breaking the Silence, Opening the Discourse. And that's by Sapan Shevin. And I want to look at chapter, now that I think about this, I'm going to do it as a separate layer. And we're going to look at chapter 3, which is testing and minorities. I think I spelled minorities correctly. And that is by Haney. And then I want on one more layer. This is actually much better than a typical whiteboard or chalkboard because I can turn off layers and move them around. I wish I had this on all of my teaching. It would make life so much easier. And on chapter 12, I would like to look at dropouts and the silencing of voices. And that one, whoops, and that one is by Stevenson and Elworth. Now, last week I posted a video on the importance of looking at communication and looking at bias. And a couple of weeks ago I posted a video on intelligence and processing, and one of the things is that we really do not understand intelligence as it is. But I think that these three will show a sample of this book, kind of go into why I like it, and at the same time there's definite lessons that researchers can learn from it, but really I want to look at it from a lens of communications. Now, at this moment, I'm going to just turn off the layers here so that the title, and I'm really dealing with this first one here, which is gifted education. I want to deal with that one first. And so I'm going to turn off these two layers so that we're only looking right now at chapter 2. Now, chapter 2 gives a history of gifted education in the United States. And for those of you that are not perhaps as versed in education in the United States, we typically have a stratified system. Now, there are, of course, always exceptions. And one of the things that I run into when I talk about the education system in the United States is that people will say, and they'll be correct when they say this, that, well, my school might not have had this. And it depends what your school what kind of school you went to. And it doesn't even have to be private and public. The education system in the United States is a patchwork of many different schools, and there are always outliers. So there are always going to be areas that perhaps this doesn't apply to. For an example, on a slightly different subject, but to give an idea of the outliers, I would teach students how to study. And in fact, once we get done with the communication segment in these videos, I think it's in 2 or 3 weeks, we're going to be starting to look at how to study correctly. Or at least strategies that might help you study better. Might be a better way to say that. And I would ask students if they were formally taught at any point on how to study. And sometimes I would get a hand that would raise up. And sometimes I would have to clarify that. Was it what one teacher gave you, or was it something that the school presented to every student that went through that grade? Typically, that hand would go down. Sometimes it did not. So when I'm now speaking about the strategies for testing and the strategies for studying and the strategies for applications, because those are all different strategies that are needed, different students would say, oh, I already learned that, already had that, but I'm teaching to the bulk of the students. So when we're looking at this idea of education, it may not all apply to every person, but I think that some of it will apply to pretty much everyone. So in a stratified system of education, we typically put in either gifted students, we may call them anything from, in the research study, the study identified them as special needs. And then we have the more average or mainline students. And then we have the special education students. And we're really looking at this in a term of, I'm going to grab this line, in a term of power. That in this book, what is determined by, what determines being a minority has to do with where power falls inside of the education spectrum. So in a stratified education system, and you might have more than 3, you might have less than 3, but you'll typically have a structured system of students that will go to special classes because perhaps they are considered to be more intelligent than your average student. Now, this poses a few problems because it, first of all, presupposes that we actually understand intelligence. And I'll put a link to the video below, but it's not likely that we actually understand intelligence. We understand how memory works. We understand how certain strategies for being able to study or being able to research work, hence this channel. But we don't necessarily understand the biology and neurology of actual intelligence and how all the different components work. Now, one of the problems is that when you talk about gifted students, are we talking about an intelligence issue, or are we talking about an economic issue? And I don't mean here that certain wealthier parents are able to afford better schools or more power for their students, for their, well, children actually in that case, but in that minorities, people who are on the edges of power in the United States, typically do not have the economic clout because we are a capitalist society in the United States. And so under a capitalist economy, the idea is, at least, if from an idealistic view, is that these idea of gifted students, and this author does bring this up, they are a commodity that are going to be able to bring power into the workforce, right? As the high school students mature, they go into better colleges, they get better degrees, they'll have more economic clout. So part of this idea of gifted students goes with an underlying understanding in the United States that those students will have economic clout that other people will not have. But also, as the author points out, this is not generally based on any particular test directly. It's a decision that is made. And those decisions can be biased. And we've talked many times about confirmation bias. I won't go into that here, but you can look at previous videos that talk about where people will oftentimes have an opinion on a certain race, a certain gender perception is considered to be more intelligent than others. And that can become an issue because we might end up with one version of students that we've identified as being gifted. And in fact, when we get into the next chapter, chapter 3, we'll look at how that could play out. But that may not actually be the case. That has to do with research bias, not with actual intelligence or actual facts and realities. Now, there are also advocacy that we have to consider. And we're also going to have a quick test here of if I can spell advocacy. I think that's right. That looks right. Or it's wrong in my notes. It's hard to say, but I think it's right. When we're looking at advocacy, one of the issues is that sometimes students, and I think we have to visit this idea that it's parents and teachers. When we're talking about power, particularly at the local level, right? Not talking about grand policies for state, but local level of schools, power does not rest in the hands of students. It rests in the hands of parents and teachers and administration. So I suppose let me add in administrators in here. So, do we have somebody who is advocating for a student? That student may end up then becoming classified in the stratified layer, in the top layer, because they have people that are backing them up. And this is one of the issues. One of the difficulties that I have with the stratified system is it really brings up the economic reality of the United States public education system. So when we talk about economic realities here, it's not just the economic reality of the student, it's also the economic reality of the that did not work. Hang on a moment here. I got to bring up my font panel here. It's also the economic reality of the fact that in the United States, schools are many times run like a business. There is a bottom line, how much money are we going to be spending on each individual student? And we have different programs. that are, and some of them are absolutely necessary, such as buses, um, and lunches, and sports, and textbooks, and classes, teachers, and salaries. We know as educators that the more students that you put into a classroom, the more likely it is that students will be impeded in learning. One of the difficulties that can exist in schools is that students who are classified as gifted students can end up in smaller classes with more attention that is spent on them. Sometimes, and the author brings this up, is that this idea of the stratified system detracts from the idea that as citizens in the United States, we are not necessarily spending the amount of money that we need to in order to help our students. That's not a new idea. There are multiple problems with the economic realities of schools in the United States, both in public schools and private schools. So one of the issues that this author brings up attention to, and it's a study, it doesn't offer a solution. It gives a background, it gives what the research results were. This was a qualitative research. And then it provides a understanding of perhaps let me rephrase this. It provides an interpretation of the results so that people can read it and then formulate their own opinions. And this is a constant in this book. The authors will advocate for something based on results, on the research. But the research is presented, it is defined, it is given a history. Other research that is done in the area is brought up. And while the authors advocate for it, there really isn't anything in the book that says you should believe this. Because that's not the point of research. Remember when we talked about the point of research, research is not to prove something. It's not to provide a proof that this is the way something is. It's to find out, to question, and then to present results. So this is an example of a chapter on it. Now we can look at a different chapter. Let me just have these slightly move away here. I think I want to move these. I want to bring up chapter 3 and look at testing and minorities. Now it's done and it's presented in the same way. Standardized testing, the history of standardized testing. It defines what standardized testing is. And it's worth looking that standardized testing is testing that is presented in the same way. It is the same questions to large groups. Again, we're looking at high schools. And it is testing that is graded in the same ways. And that can, by the way, become a problem. So, in the history of the United States, we have had standardized tests that go perhaps across an entire state. So, you'll have standardized testings in urban communities. You'll have the same test given in rural communities. You'll have the same standardized test given in suburban communities. And you'll have the same standardized test given in perhaps an inner city community. And then you will have, let me bring my line back just to neaten these up just a little bit. It will snap onto the line. Good. Okay. And then I'm going to look at, still doesn't look even to me. And then I'm going to look at these particular scores and I'm going to rank them. Now, for those of you that are not aware, perhaps you believe that there is no racism in the United States anymore. I have bad news for you. Or perhaps you believe that we treat genders equally in the United States, and I have bad news for you there too. Or perhaps you believe that you are not biased, and I have bad news there too. Because all of those things exist. We all have biases. I have biases. Every professor I've ever met has a bias. Every person I meet has a bias. Some hide it better, some are more aware of it, but we have biases. And they're not all biases on race. They could be on economics, or on religion, or on location, perhaps geography. And so as a researcher, we have to work against that. But if we look here at this particular issue, what if we had a racial minority? And again, we're looking at power, not numbers. So sometimes people will say, well, there's more females in the United States than males. So how can they be a minority in whatever context I'm talking about? Let's say politics. Well, do women have the same number of positions in that politics? For instance, Congress. No, Congress is dominated by men. So it doesn't matter looking at general population numbers if you still have marginalization occurring due to access to power. And when we're looking at silenced voices, or beyond silenced voices, which is the title of the book, marginalization is defined in this book through multiple research studies as a power issue. Do people have the power to be able to actuate their particular agenda? And if you have economic realities here, so then a biased researcher might conclude that a particular racial minority which exists in the inner city is somehow not as good at, not as intelligent, not as academically inclined, lazier, any number of derogatory labels that we're going to put on that does not take into account the more appropriate, perhaps, labels of looking at this through a lens. Oops, not that one. Hang on. I always do that. I don't click onto it. All right, let's try that again. And not look at the other factors of, I'll get it this time, of economics at population densities. And population densities are important because oftentimes they will decide how many people will be in the classroom. Teacher salaries. I mean, I'm as motivated by money as anyone else, so I consider myself a pretty decent teacher. I'm going to generally move to where there's a decent salary. That doesn't mean that teachers that work in poorer districts are worse, but it does mean that you might have lower standards, that you might have less resources. It doesn't mean that they don't try. Personally, that's what I would look for in a teacher, is I want a teacher that I can communicate with. I don't need that a teacher that has published 400 articles. Although, personally, that would be pretty cool. But what I'm really looking for is a teacher that I can talk with, that is approachable. Are you going to get the same things here? So independent of the tests, assuming that the tests are given the same and graded the same, are we also keeping into account these? The answer is no, we're not. And we know this. We know this from numerous studies. And Haney presents some of those results in there as well. Now let me move these off here for a moment. And let me bring back my black. And we also want to look at the idea of interpretation, because that was the first part. We have the standardized tests, but we also have an interpretation of those results. Because oftentimes we're not considering the other things that lie the foundation for why things might be different. I just accidentally deleted inner city, it looks like. Let's see. Let's put it back. Good. And then bring it down. So we have a standardized test. We have an interpretation of results. Standardized tests are independent of grades. Grades may be a better indicator. Haney presents a set of studies that show that grades might have a better result for a student's capabilities. However, the interpretation of grades is an issue, and it will vary between different schools. Also, curriculums will vary between schools, and I'll talk about curriculums a little bit when I do the next chapter of 12. But when we're looking at these tests, we can't say that they're going to be graded correctly, or rather, we're going to be graded exactly the same. It's not the same people that are grading them. And that the interpretation might not be the same, and that the material may not be the same. That was been presented in the same direction. I think that when we look at this idea of tests, that we, and I'm not going to say that we shouldn't have tests, but I'm not certain that the way that we test is necessarily the best. typically when we talk about a test, and this is not actually in the chapter, but it might give a little more understanding to the chapter. And it's one of the things I would have liked to see that the chapter actually presented a little more of, but there may have been I don't want to knock the author and say, well, they should have done it this way, because it may be that there was a time space, that there's only so much that we can put in, and Haiti might have had to write a book to go into this, but there is a thing called a formative test. A formative test is when you're testing before the knowledge is necessarily imparted to the student. Not every student starts at the same level of knowledge, 0. And there's a saying sometimes that I hear in schools, because I work in the schools, and I feel like I spelled formative incorrectly. Isn't that supposed to be an A in there? Formative. I think so. But there's also, they'll say, well, the student's an empty cup and we're just going to fill it with our knowledge. This annoys me to no end. Probably out of proportion. But filling it with what? And then we have summative tests. Well, let's do summative test. We'll keep the plural agreement, or rather singular agreement in this case. So I give a formative test to students, and this is where they've started at different points, and I've done this multiple times through classes. And then we have various quizzes along the way, and we have a summative test. Some students will start at 0. And they will start here at the 0 mark. Other students will start at having 10. They know some of those. They'll get 10 questions right out of 100, or 1 question right out of 10. And then some students will start where they're already at 80. They could probably pass the final exam. And then let's look at end results. This student ended up with 50. Probably failed the class. This student ended up with a 90. This student ended up with an 80. Who learned more? Who got more out of that class? The student that was able to answer 50 questions more than they were in the beginning, or half the test out of 10 or 20, or the student that didn't improve at all. Why should these students here, they started at 80, they should have been able to bring their knowledge up to 120, 150. There's only 100, I would like to see 100 there. I've actually given formative tests, had students pass the tests with 70s, 80s, 90s, in a couple of cases 100. When they take the summative test at the end, they've gone down to 70. In one memorable instance, they actually failed the class. And then they would ask and say, well, how come you didn't challenge me more? And that leads to a whole new situation, because that situation leads to a question of responsibility. And I don't exactly have an answer of this. Whose responsibility is it for a student to take control of the class? Now, I would argue in elementary, junior high, even high school, that the responsibility lies primarily with the parents and the teachers and the administration, because they are the ones that have the power. But I teach in college. So, who is the responsibility to? I would argue that it's a shared responsibility. Those students that did not improve, did they participate? Did they do more work? Did they go to the teacher for extra? Because I've had students that do that. They not only get 100 here, but they're able to produce extra information and projects. And at the end of the term, they'll come up in front of the class and give what amounts to be a summative test, or provide a leadership learning opportunity for those students by guiding others through. When we're talking about testing, one of the things that I would have personally liked to see in this particular chapter is a little bit more on the distance between a formative and summative tests. Now, perhaps that wasn't in the research. There are positive reasons on why that might have not been presented. But my thoughts were that I would have liked to see it presented. We're going to move on into the last chapter of 12. Now, while I'm doing that, I should also point out that this is, I have to find it, because that's 3. There we go. That there is quite a bit in the book about sexuality and genders. It's really has to do with our understanding in schools of when we deal with concepts of masculinity. I think they're very culturally appropriate to some of the things that are going on in education now in the United States. I'm not going to cover it right here. I might come back to it. But when we look at things like homosexuality and heterosexuality, when we look at the idea of the feminine versus the masculine and how that's being treated in education, that people tend to view these concepts as a black and white with strong opinions that they have, and many times they will bring in other baggage such as spiritual, from religious teachings or parental teachings. And it goes back to the very beginning video, the first one I posted, which is our ontology is our beliefs, epistemology, which is how do we know what those beliefs are? How do we know what we know? And the methodology of how do we test of what we know is how we know. And I think that is that has more baggage that I wanted to get into now. I'm already at the 45-minute mark. So, and I want to end this in an hour. I might come back to it later because there needs to be a discussion about how gender influences education, but I don't want to have it right now. For those that are interested, I think that the middle of this book will be quite interesting. If you have strong opinions about things such as homosexuality, this book may not be the best for you, particularly if you have a negative opinion on it. On the other hand, perhaps it's exactly what you should do. I am also an advocate that when you research something, you read what you don't like. And you read the studies that you don't like. And then you defend that position, because if you cannot defend that position without distorting the studies, perhaps your particular position is indefensible and you need to go back and do some research. So let's go into chapter 12. We're looking at dropouts and silencing voices, which is really, we're talking about here, the dropouts are the marginalized group. And I really chose this. I was thinking about doing heterosexuality versus homosexuality, which is one of the chapters in the book. But I did this instead, and the primarily reason I did this is because my dissertation was based on this idea of retention of students. And this has been changing slowly. An author that I credit for changing the conversation some is Tinto. And for people who have heard of this author, I don't want to use red. I'm against using red as a teacher. So it's why I used to grade students still do when I grade students, or I do a peer review of something, I tend to use blue or green or something rather than red, because red is a negative connotation. So, just, we don't have to do that. It's bad enough that we're making a correction here. We don't have to make it a negative correction. Not all criticism has to be negative. Tinto wrote about the idea between a institutional responsibility and a student responsibility. And I'm just going to put this up here. And this holds as true, I think, for high schools and colleges. But when we look at this, the study itself was an ethnography in, which is that they looked at and did interviews across a group of students, in this case high school dropouts, looking for common themes for this. But it's also true, I think, to a large extent in the upper education, and Tinto addresses this in upper education, which is not actually in this book. Although it may be one of the references inside of the chapter, I do not know that. But I'll put down Tinto's book in the links down below in the video. I would have to quickly look it up. It's the I guess it's the issue of doing these more on an off-the-cuff manner and a conversational manner than a totally scripted out first presentation. But we have institutional and we have student. All right. Perhaps what I should do, I have the book right here. That's chapter 12. So let me look at zip through it real quickly here and see if I see Tinto there. So it is always wonderful working with a book that has references. So let us see. Chapter 12. And there's 15 chapters total. We do not have. Tinto was not listed here, but Tinto did most of his work in college. His book was Leaving College, and that doesn't surprise me from this being in high school, but I would hate to say that he wasn't in there and then he was. So, and by the way, one of the things that is really nice about this book is that at the end of the book, there's an appendix, and each chapter brings up its references so that you can quickly look them up. But this idea between institutional and student, there's a popular opinion, and it's still popular, by the way, among professors that I run into, is that when a student drops out, it's a failing on the student's part. And that is not always the case. There is a perceptual difference between what the school believes and what the student believes. Now, in this particular case, Stevenson and Ellsworth bring up that their research is largely with adolescents. And in adolescence, one of the hallmarks of adolescence in schooling is that they are forming their identity. Sometimes there's this idea that a student in high school has already formed their identity. That is not really correct. Usually the identity hasn't been formed until they have moved into adulthood or post-adolescence. And there's also a belief that adolescence and puberty is the same thing, just so that we understand it is not. Adolescence has to do, when we're talking about this idea of adolescence, and I put it here because I don't mean that adolescence, I mean this adolescence. When we're talking about the theme adolescence, and rather than the identity of an adolescent, then we're looking at the chemical and physical changes to the brain that has to do with behavior. When we're looking at puberty, we're looking at physical and chemical changes to the body. And there is this popular perception that they are the same thing. They are not. And so that is something that sometimes has to be clarified. When adolescents are forming their identity, that does not mean that if they drop out, it is necessarily their fault. It may be their fault. But we shouldn't assume that it is. One of the common complaints in the ethnographic study is that the teachers didn't listen to them, or that the material was boring and they couldn't see a connection to life. How are they going to use this later on? And those are valid points. It isn't up to the student to know how they're going to use that work when they get out into the career or into college, because they aren't there yet. They can't know that. I have this conversation with college students all the time. They'll tell me in their first year of English, perhaps, well, I'll never use English as an engineer. Really? You're never going to write reports as an engineer? Or in a corporation? Or as a banker? I find that hard to believe. They don't see that because they're not there yet. It's the English teacher's job to make that connection for them, because the English teacher presumably has the experience to know when they're going to be able to use that work. But by casting this idea that somehow the adolescent is at fault for not knowing what they can't know, right? They can't know what a career requires that they're not in. And even and I'll have this conversation down here with students who will say, well, my mother is a teacher, so I know exactly what is needed. No, you don't, because it's different watching a career and actually being in that career. And by the way, those same students that I'll have that conversation with, they might come back in 5 to 10 years. In a couple cases, I actually taught with them again, and they were like, I didn't know this. I didn't realize it, because it's much easier to look at it and say, I have a generalized idea. But you can't say you know exactly what it is, and you don't know when you're going to use it. So when we're looking at this idea of dropouts, we should not be marginalizing their voices. They dropped out for a reason. And it may be something to do with them, but it's not necessarily based on their culture or their family or anything in particular that we based it on. Sometimes it's simply based on an expectation that faculty has that is perhaps unrealistic. I spoke with teachers in a group down here in college. And I asked them for what their expectation was. It was about 35 perhaps teachers that were in a group. I was doing a little presentation. And the question was that I asked the teachers was, what was the expectation of when students come into the classroom? What do you, as a teacher, expect the students to do? The teachers told me pretty much uniformly across that they expect the students to come in with a notebook and pens, to be ready to take notes, to have their textbook ready, to have done the pre-reading, to be sitting there ready to do it, and to participate in the class with asking questions. And they did not feel that this was unreasonable. I felt it was unreasonable. And the reason I felt it was unreasonable is because not a single one of them did that. Not one of those 35 teachers. I called them out on it. They got very offended. I didn't really care. They deserved to be offended at that point, truthfully. The amazing part to me was not that they got offended. The amazing part was that the administration asked me back. And by the way, the teachers asked me back, which I found amazing because I figured I offended them. And I wasn't particularly trying to be nice to them. They knew that this was a teaching seminar. They did not come in with notebooks. They did not have pens. They came in and they were talking about various things. They had a bad attitude about being there. They're the teachers. They've had, at a minimum, 6 to 8 more years of education on what should be expected than the students. Why should they be expecting this to be different? Many of them were on their cell phones, and yet one of the things they hated was that students would be on their cell phones. The expectation for the teachers, I consider to be unrealistic. Setting the expectation is actually a job of the teacher. This is what I expect. And it's an explicit understanding. So when we silence the voices of people who have dropped out, why did they drop out? And it's not always their fault. And it is very unfair, I think, for this assumption that when a student drops out of high school or drops out of college, that it's a moral failing on the part of the student. It might be, but it doesn't have to be. This is only 3 chapters out of the book. And I found that the book was quite interesting from a viewpoint of our communications and thinking about who has been marginalized in communications, and marginalized in a term of power. When we talk about critical power structures in the United States in schools and education, if you have an interest in that, I would suggest reading this book. There's a more modern, updated version of this book, but it's the same authors and editors in it largely. And so I would suggest for people to read it. There are a few things. The basic thing that I have, and probably the biggest issue that I had with it, was in the title, was that really economics needed to be in there, and it needed to define that it's really high schools. The other thing is that, as I said about the assessments, and there could be a little updated on some of the gender studies, but overall I found this to be a very useful book, and I still use it as a reference book. If you found this to be a useful video, feel free to give me a like. If you subscribe, I post 2 videos currently a week. One is a content video on some aspect of research or education, and one is a video on a Let's Play where I am currently drowning the base as I show problem solving, or I guess actually in that case the lack of problem solving, on Oxygen Not Included. That will conclude in a few weeks, if I'm lucky. If I'm not, it will conclude perhaps in the next episode. And we'll move on to another one of using video games where they can teach in education. Thank you very much. I'll see you next week.